in my head, my heart, my understanding. Amen. Happy Easter, everybody.
Happy Easter.
I was sitting in my rocking chair. I think I've starting every sermon like this, and eventually I'll put a book of sermons together, and the title of it will be, I was sitting in my rocking chair. But I was sitting in my rocking chair in my office, reflecting, as I do every week, on the gospel and on this particular resurrection story that's told in Mark. If you were following along in your reading, you notice that it stopped before the reading stopped. And I'm going to tell you that now, because what Ron read is the way the first manuscript read. It stopped exactly where it stopped instead of that addition that you see in the printed bulletin. So when I was thinking about that, I couldn't help but remember a game that I used to play with my kids, who are now too old for me. But they used to love this game. I would start a story, and I would get to a certain, I just make it up, and I'd start a story, and I'd start making up this story, and I'd get to a certain part, and I would end and point to one of them, and they would pick up where I left off. And they would do the same thing, and then they would point to somebody, and it bounced around like that. And every time somebody got the story at the end, they tended just naturally to begin a whole new storyline. And so what was so much fun about it was you never knew exactly where the story was going to go, because in the end was always the beginning. So in Mark's gospel, what we get, either by Mark's intention or by the fact that maybe a scroll was lost, but a lot of scholars agree that it was by Mark's intention that it stops with the women coming to an empty tomb, being told to go back to Galilee, and I'll say a little more about that in a minute, but that it stops right there with, they left and they were afraid. Now I hear that in the original writing of the gospel, the language in which it was written, or at least in the Greek manuscript, which is one of the oldest, it ends with the Greek word gar, which means for. So you can imagine the word F-O-R, for. And Mark ending his gospel with saying that they got to the tomb, it was empty. They said they were told that Jesus had risen to go back to Galilee. They left. They were afraid for, and that's it. That's the earliest gospel we have. So it's the earliest account we have of resurrection. Later in John and in Luke and in Matthew, you'll get all sorts of endings. And apparently at some point in the construction of the Bible, whoever was redacting it thought it was a problem that Mark had left it that way. And so when you actually study Mark, you'll see that there's two alternative endings to go with it. One of them is what they included in your book. But there is an awful lot of power in that open-ended story that leaves us hanging a bit about what to expect next. The women come to the tomb. They're expecting to find the body of Jesus. But when they get to the tomb, the stone is rolled back and the tomb is empty. A young man in white tells them that they need not look for Christ among the dead, because Christ is risen. Christ is alive. And he's gone ahead of them to Galilee just as he had told them. And in Mark's gospel, he does tell them this before he dies. He says, things are going to happen, but, I will meet you in Galilee afterwards. Go back there. And Galilee, you see, is where they all live. I mean, Jesus ran around all over the country with those 12 guys. And some women that followed them too, But their homes, where they lived their life, was in Galilee. And so Jesus had told them, whatever happens, happens. No matter what, go to Galilee. So we don't really know if the women did or not. We kind of assume they did because of the other things we get, but all we know is that they left and went home. I guess. You know, but we don't know. You see, Mark leaves us wondering, I think, on purpose. What will the women do? What will they do with their fear? Will they ever tell what they saw? Will they go back to Galilee? Will they experience the aliveness of a risen Christ right where they live? And if they do, what difference will it make? What difference will it make in their lives? What difference will it make in the life of the world? We just don't know what their experience was. The end of Mark creates an opportunity and an invitation for us to fill in the blanks for ourselves and about ourselves. For example, when we stand staring into the emptiness of a tomb in which all our hopes have been buried, what will we do? I found a lot of people talking about that just in the last several months, about feeling like this is a time not only in their lives, but in the life of the world where they just don't understand what's going on. And it's like staring into an emptiness and not quite knowing what to do. So what do we do when we stand? Will we believe that Christ is alive and waiting for us, not above, but ahead of us, wanting to draw us into the future? What will we fear when we stare into our own empty tombs? Who will we tell about our fears? Will we continue with our life doing what we usually do and just expect that somehow there's going to be a way forward, a way for us to enter into, a way that will lead to new ways of living? When we stand at the end of one way of living life, will we be willing to enter with joy into a new way of living? That's Mark's message for us about the resurrection of Jesus. His message is that the resurrection is not only about Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus tells us something about the possibilities for life that Christ continues to open for us. Wherever we live our lives, whatever we're doing, at whatever stage of life we are, if we're nearing the end of it, if we're in the middle of it, if we're just beginning to come into our own, if we are like my granddaughter, just waiting to graduate from high school so she can get to college like she's always wanted to do since she was 7 years old. You know, whatever moment of life you are in, this message is for you and me and for all of us. That wherever we live our lives and whatever happens in our lives, we always have the opportunity to become aware of Christ alive with us, and most importantly, within us. Because in every end that brings us to the brink of an empty tomb, Christ is always beckoning us into a future with possibilities greater than we have ever hoped or imagined. The hymn we sang before the gospel, the hymn, Christ is Alive, hymn 182. It's a case in point. I'll just remind you of the first verse. It starts with this proclamation. He even has an exclamation point out of it. Christ is alive. Let Christians sing, the cross stands empty to the sky. Let streets and homes with praises ring, his love in death shall never die. Now they're powerful words in and of themselves, but they're more powerful when you learn the story of why Brian Wren, a British pastor, wrote these words. pastor was in charge of a Congregationalist church. And he wrote this hymn that we sang this morning. It's specifically for the Easter Sunday that occurred on April 14th, 1968. Now think about that day, April 14th, 1968. That Easter day was just 10 days after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he had to lead an Easter service and preach an Easter service just 10 days after that. And he wrote the text because he was struggling with his own reaction to the assassination of Dr. King. He was struggling certainly over the tragic death of someone he admired greatly. But he was also struggling with an overwhelming sense that somehow the whole vision that Dr. King had preached and taught and lived and been assassinated for, that he was so afraid that somehow that whole vision would die too. And in the assassination of King, the vision of God's justice and peace and love for the entirety of creation, for all people certainly, but for the entirety of creation, because Dr. King got that. And when you read some of his sermons, oh, it comes through so clearly that this is about everything. And so, as Dr. Wren thought about that Easter service, he just found it was hard to even think about singing the joyful hymns that they always sing, because all he could feel was this heaviness, this grief, and a crushing sense of bleakness that seemed to somehow snuff out the usual words he would preach on Easter. He might have felt a bit like those women so long ago, standing ready as they were to anoint the dead body of Jesus, then confronted with an empty tomb and a fear of the future. The hymn text, I think, is basically Dr. Wren trying to work all that out. Because when I meditated on it, it was so clear in the verses. And if you want to turn back to 182, I'm going to kind of go through those verses, because I think what Dr. Wren worked out was something that we work out too. I'm just going to make a couple of comments about it. He begins that first verse with that strong proclamation, Christ is alive. And I get the impression that he needed to hear himself say that. Sometimes we need to say that at the times we feel the least like being able to say that. And I kind of feel like that's where he started. Just, Christ is alive. And then he goes on to deal with the fact the cross is empty. Because I think in some way, he was feeling himself get stuck at that cross. Which is so easy to do, is it not, in our own lives? When we have those cross moments in life. I mean, a cross is wherever sort of the goodness meets up with the powers of the world in a way that creates a cross. It creates havoc in your life. And it can happen for so many different reasons. But it's so easy to just get stuck there. And that even though we're not on the cross anymore, it's an empty cross, we just can't seem to leave it. Kind of like the empty tomb. I wonder about that because I know that I've been there before. And I know how hard it is to move. But you see, the truth about life is that you cannot stay stuck in the past and move on to the future at the same time. If you're going to move on to the future, you got to be willing to leave the cross. Maybe Dr. Wren had something going like that, because in the second verse, he starts thinking about what it means for Christ to be alive. What it means to acknowledge that it's time to leave a cross and move on to resurrection. He writes about the freedom the resurrection brings for the Christ that we know, that we met in Jesus. For that Christ, the pre-crucifixion Christ, to not be confined anymore. The pre-crucifixion Jesus was confined to one time and one place. The risen Christ is able to be present everywhere and everywhen. It's a good reminder that when we speak of the resurrected Christ, we are not thinking that somewhere in this world there's a first century Jewish carpenter wandering around with a hole in his side and wounds in his hands. I say this every Easter, but until everybody gets the point, I'm going to continue to say it. The story of the risen Christ is not the story of a resuscitated corpse. The story of resurrection is not the story of a resurrected corpse. Resurrection is a new way of being. Think of it like evolution, okay? You know that in most of the years, billions and billions of years of evolution, humans were not even on the scene. That if you took up and lined up volumes that told the history of the whole history of creation, humans don't come along until about the middle of the very last volume, and it's going on. So things move and change. Well, we see as we read the biblical narrative that the relationship with God and his people continues to evolve, continues to grow, continues to move to new experiences of being that sometimes their cosmology didn't understand at all, and today our cosmology just says, well, yeah, that's a natural law of nature. So what we see in Jesus is a resurrection that Christians say we believe for everybody. What throws us off is it says resurrection of the body. And all we think about when we think of the body is the body we know. So I looked at a picture of me as a baby recently, and you know what? That body didn't look anything like this body. And science tells me that I didn't even have the same cells that I've got now in my body. And if we think about bodies of other physical things in this world, we're pretty comfortable with the natural way that, say, water can be transformed into ice, can be transformed into vapor, and it's still H2O. That the basic element, the basic body of what makes up water doesn't change. H2O. But H2O can be transformed into water, it can be transformed into ice, it can be transformed into vapor. In one of Paul's letters, the Apostle Paul, he tries to say pretty much that same thing using plants. To get us to understand that no, we're not talking about a movie where the actor who goes down as Jesus just pops right back up in 3 days. A little bit worse for the wear, but basically the same thing. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about new life. Which is what life is like, is it not? When we go through our life, do we not live, and then parts of our life dies, whether it's by going from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood or wherever, or whether it's by getting married, or whether it's by getting divorced, or whether it's by a birth, or whether it's by a death. Life is about living life, dying in certain parts of life, and then what do? Do you just pop back the way you were? What happens? Tell me. What happens?
Resurrected.
You change, yeah. You're transformed into the next stage of life. So it's so important to remember that when we say Christ is alive, that's what we're saying. And he goes on in the 3rd and 4th verses to basically just play with that theme of all the different things that means if you're thinking about Christ being alive in that way. And then in the last, he kind of gives us a hint of what this all hangs on. He says, Christ is alive in the spirit that burns through this and every age. The spirit that always moves creation towards more joy, more justice, more love, more praise for whatever contributes to the well-being of all. We see this Christ alive wherever and whenever we participate in creating beauty, in creating truth, whenever we participate in creating goodness and well-being for all and the whole of creation, human and non-human alike. That is what it means the Spirit of Christ to be alive. Because it is up to you and me and all of us together to embody the Spirit of the risen Christ each and every day. In the little ways we are with each other, and for some of us, from time to time, perhaps in a very big way that might make a difference in the whole future of the world. So here's the thing on this Easter. Wouldn't hurt to remind yourself of the 50 days of Easter this every morning when you look in the mirror. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid when you find yourself on the brink of an uncertain future. Do not be alarmed when you want so badly to see Jesus, but instead find yourself staring into an empty tomb. Don't get overwhelmed by the cross. Don't get stuck at the tomb. Remember that Christ always lives among the living. And where the end is, there is the beginning.